Hey there, and welcome to Broadband Deployment News. So this past week, a week ago or so, Alan Davidson, Assistant Secretary of the NTIA, was at Mountain Connect, and he answered some really interesting and key questions about the Broadband Infrastructure Act and when funds will be released, those kinds of things. Be right back, and we'll discuss that. Thanks for joining me for Broadband Deployment News. So as I mentioned, Alan Davidson, he's the Assistant Secretary of the NTIA and the guy who's kind of in charge of everything, answered what they're calling here some burning broadband funding questions. And I would agree, these are questions that I had, and I think I knew some of the answers, but he also clarified some things for me. So I thought I'd walk through this article real quick and kind of point out this, especially, if you were not at Mountain Connect or you didn't get a chance to stream. They did stream, it was really nice. They did stream the sessions there, including his Q&A with Drew Clark on the Broadband Act. So I was going to go through and just kind of walk through this and see what he had to say. So the NTIA recently unveiled the rules that will apply to $45 billion in broadband funding, opening the door to an influx of investment. However, the rules, which were presented in a series of NOFOs, Notice of Funding Opportunities, seem to have raised as many questions as they answered. So speaking at Mountain Connect on Tuesday, Alan Davidson tackled a range of queries in both the keynote session and the media roundtable. Here's what he had to say about 5 key issues. So when will the money start flowing? So that's always been a question. I've said that we're not really going to see most of this until sometime spring of next year, maybe, as they start to do this, but there will be funds available before that. It says for many, the question of when money will become available from the Bead program, that's the $42.5 million, and NTIA's other grant programs is top of mind. According to Davidson, they expect to start doling out grant money later this year, though likely not from Bead quite yet. The Bead funding is tied to the availability of new broadband coverage maps from the FCC. While these will be more accurate than those in the past, they will take a little bit of time, yes. He said, Davidson added the FCC expects to collect data for its new maps this summer and present its findings for a challenge process in the fall. So what he's talking about there is starting on June 30th, service providers are going to be required to start uploading into what they're calling the Broadband Serviceable Location Fabric, I think is what it's called. It's basically a fabric of data that's going to be underlying the broadband map. So each service provider needs to load up into that data set all of the areas that it's basically all their homes pass. So this would be anywhere that they currently can provide broadband service. That would include current customers as well as customers that they could provide broadband service to with a standard installation. In other words, let's say 10 days or less. If somebody calls up and says, hey, I'd like a broadband connection, they can get that installed in 10 days, or if it's more than 10 days because they got people out with the flu or whatever, it's just basically a standard broadband installation. So they need to upload all of that information into this fabric, including the speeds that customers can get, including whether it's low latency, which is anything under 100 milliseconds round trip, which most service providers are going to be able to provide that. They need to put that in that broadband fabric, and then from that, the FCC is going to be creating these broadband maps, this visual map where you can look and see every location in the United States. You should be able to type in your address at some point and see, oh, what options do I have? What speeds do they say I'm getting? That kind of thing. Then he mentions the challenge process here. Once all that information is uploaded, then there's going to be a challenge process. For example, the states can look at it and go, wait a minute, we don't show that this area is served, or we don't see that we're getting this speed in this area. So there'll be a challenge process back and forth. So sometime later in the fall, it could be much later in the fall, because again, you've got this challenge back and forth. Then at some point, the FCC is going to say, okay, these maps are set, here's what we're going with. So that step is required before the bulk of the money from the Bead program can be released. And that's because the money is supposed to go to unserved and underserved areas. So if you don't know what's unserved and underserved at a particular address, then you can't start allocating that money. And that's going to be, when I say it's going to go there, it's going to go to each state, and the amount that they get is going to be based on their percentage of unserved locations versus the percentage of unserved locations across the entire country. And then there's the U.S. territories as well that are going to get a piece of that. So that's kind of the first step to be getting a lot of this money. But there's some funds that are going to flow first. So he says, while it's unclear when exactly the maps will be finished, Davidson said the NTIA will be able to allocate money except initial broadband, not except, so maybe allocate money, except initial broadband plans from states and move very rapidly after that to get funding out the door. Under Bead rules, NTIA will release the first 20% of the state's allocated total once it receives the initial plan, with the remainder to follow once the state's final proposal is approved by the agency. So I'm not sure where that, I would have had a follow-up question here, I think. I'm not sure where that 20%, is that before the maps or after the maps? Because each state is supposed to get a minimum of $100 million. And then from there, again, the additional money will be based on the distribution of unserved in that state versus the universe of unserved throughout the United States and the territories. So I'm thinking that this will also have to be after the maps. So, but they will be doing the planning process. The states will be doing the planning process. They'll be able to get their planning funds. That's 5% of the 100 million. So they'll be able to get up to 500 million of planning funds, where they'll be doing things like setting up their broadband office, hiring people, working, doing local community engagement. Very important to figure out, okay, who's out there, who are the stakeholders, we need to get their opinions, their proposals, those kinds of things. So all of that's going to be taking place. So as far as these funds, is 20%. And then the remainder that comes, again, that I think even the 20%, I think will have to be based on the maps coming out first. The good news is, it's not like we just have to wait for this bead and there's nothing else happening, Davidson added, pointing to the NTIA's $1 billion enabling middle mile broadband infrastructure and $1.5 billion state digital equity capacity grant program. So those are two other programs. There are notice of funding opportunities for both of those that I did a quick video about, where I kind of walk through the NOFO. So that middle mile, there's not a requirement for the maps to be done on that. And that middle mile is very important for this last mile stuff, because if you've got these little islands of no broadband or slow broadband, and you need middle mile infrastructure there or better middle mile infrastructure there, then all of that can be taking place while, even before this money comes out for the last mile stuff. It says we're launching a middle mile program. That grant making is going to happen much more quickly. It's going to start this year, so people will be able to start getting money this year. You can already put in your applications for this. And he says, whether by accident or design, it's the right approach. We'll be doing our middle mile work first. The idea is that it's a force multiplier for our last mile work, and that will be funding through Bead. He added, digital equity planning grants will also be rolling out in the short term, and those are grants to be able to, those are planning grants to be able to make sure that you've got everything in place for digital equity as you apply these funds as well. Do the Bead rules mean unserved and underserved areas are being treated equally? This is another question that came up. So just to recap, unserved under this act means anyone that has less than 25 by 3, that's 25 megabits per second, down by 5 megabits per second up. Underserved is anyone that has less than 100 by 20, but of course not unserved. So really it would be anything over 25 by 3, but less than 100 by 20, that's considered underserved. And he says, in a word, no. Davidson noted that some have misrepresented the Bead rules as treating unserved and underserved locations the same, but that's a mistake. Covering unserved areas is still a top priority, but he explained that those states which can demonstrate in their broadband plans that they'll reach all the unserved will be able to use funding for underserved areas as well. So in other words, if a state a lot of states are already trying to figure out what's unserved and underserved. They're not waiting for these maps, and I think a lot of the states will have a very good handle on that before the FCC maps come out. So they're probably already thinking, okay, we've got this number of unserved areas, this number of underserved areas. If we apply the funding, then we know we can cover all the unserved areas and start covering underserved areas at the same time, because you can actually do that. You can, if you've got areas that have got unserved and underserved together, you can go ahead. You don't need to connect all the unserved up and then say, okay, well now we got to get this pocket of underserved people. It's not that way. So you can have a project that's an underserved project where it includes both underserved and unserved. But the NTIA is going to be very strict about making sure that any plans are going to be sure to cover everybody that's unserved initially, okay, even if you're covering underserved people at the same time. So that's what he's saying here. He says covered unserved is still the top priority, but he explained that those states that can demonstrate that can use those funds for underserved as well. He says we're really just trying to be pragmatic about how this is going to roll out. the notion that we would do all grant making and build out all of the 25.3 unserved and then come back years later, and that's what it could look like, and do the unserved just didn't seem to make practical sense, didn't seem practical or the intent of Congress. So, there's no reason to do that. You want to kind of attack everything at once, especially considering the fact that a lot of times you've got unserved and underserved kind of all mixed together. In fact, an unserved location, according to the Act, could be one home or one business. So, if you've got mostly underserved kinds of areas, and then, you're going to want to attack those couple of unserved at the same time, you really need to do that all at the same time. Do the Bead rules mean satellite and other non-fiber services won't be eligible for funding? So this was also another question that a lot of people were considering, and me as well. And I actually, this was really clarified for me through what he said here. So he says, again, no, it's true that the NTIA and Bead rules said it will count areas covered only by satellite broadband or service based on unlicensed spectrum as unserved, and also expressed a preference for fiber. However, Davidson said he expects satellite and other non-fiber technologies will receive plenty of funding. This is an infrastructure project that's designed to last for years, and we do put our thumb on the scale on the most resilient, future-proof technologies that we can, he said, but NTIA knows that there has to be an escape valve for states, and for the really high-cost areas, we fully expect that there will be states who have significant portions for other technologies. So, in other words, a state can get funding for satellite, and this was something I wasn't sure about, because if you read the NOFO, and I'm going to go to this in a second, it sounds like maybe that's not the case, but states can get funding for satellite. I'll show you right here, as it is from the NOFO. They define reliable broadband service as the term reliable broadband service means broadband service that the broadband data maps show is accessible to a location via fiber optic technology, cable modem hybrid fiber coax technology. That's basically cable service or DOCSIS service. And then surprisingly, DSL, digital subscriber line technology, but of course it's got to be over 100 by 20 to qualify. Or terrestrial fixed wireless technology, utilizing entirely licensed spectrum or using a hybrid of licensed and unlicensed spectrum. So that is what the definition of this reliable broadband service is, but it doesn't say that you can't apply those funds to something else. But here's what it does say a little further down in there. It says, again, criteria for reliable broadband service. For the purposes of the Bead program, locations served exclusively by satellite, services using entirely unlicensed spectrum, or a technology specified by the Commission for purposes of the broadband data maps do not meet the criteria for reliable broadband service and so will be considered unserved. So it's not saying that states cannot apply that money to satellite or completely unlicensed spectrum. If they see that, this is the only way we're going to get broadband to this area in a reasonable fashion in a reasonable amount of time, then they can go ahead and apply those funds, and they can apply that to somehow maybe for low Earth orbit satellite. They're not going to put up their own low Earth orbit satellites, but maybe they provide some subsidies for maybe the terminals that are required to the customers there, so they don't have to pay for all that setup. And that could go back to somebody like Starlink. That might be one way to do it. Or it could be a provider that maybe does not have licensed CBRS spectrum. They don't have a priority access license, but they can use the general access license, so it's unlicensed. It's less costly for them. They have a lower overhead, so they keep the prices down. And they could do something like CBRS there. But what it does mean is that area will still be considered unserved. So that would then be fair game for any other operator. Now, if it's really in a really hard to reach area, then, fiber could come in, but if it's really hard to reach, they're probably not going to. So again, I think that does make sense, that if satellite is the only alternative, at some point maybe fiber does become an alternative. That can be overbuilt at that point. But there's also an ending to this funding as well. So, but this is interesting. This really clarified this for me. So I got a few comments here from Conway Fan 98. If Charter builds a fiber optic network through RDOF and the speeds don't reach the 100 by 20, for example, their cheapest options provide services of 100 by 10 and 200 by 10. Would those regions still be counted as underserved and eligible for Bead funding? Let's see. So they don't reach 100 by 20, 100 by 10. Yeah, they would still be they would still be considered underserved and eligible for BEAD funding. The upload speed for those plans doesn't meet the 20 megabits per second under the BEAD program. Yeah, that's true. And that's probably DSL, right? Yeah, and I know that you've been kind of waiting for fiber to come into that area. So Charter will have to upgrade their network there, or somebody can come in and overbuild that. There could possibly be BEAD funds assigned to that. Now, whether or not that's prioritized, if there's already 100 by 10 or 200 by 10, that's another question. Because they're really going to be trying to go after those areas that are unserved first, like 25 by 3, and then the underserved happens. But if that is an area that they feel the state feels like it can cover all unserved and then also cover that area as well, then that would be the case, yes. Good question. Let's see, so back to here. Let's see, so we mentioned that. So how will the BEAD rules take RDOF coverage into account? So this was another question I had, because there's a lot of money out there. Charter, one of them, has got a lot of RDOF money that they are winning. So I would suspect that Charter, to keep these areas safe from competitive overbuilding from other operators, will probably apply RDOF funds to your area. So hopefully you'll be covered by that. The RDOF funds are something that are still up in the air for a lot of areas, because as I was mentioning, I did a broadcast I think it was last week, on the latest RDOF ready to authorize funds, and there were 2 operators in there, but there are still some larger operators that have not received anything, and we don't know what's going to happen with that. One of them is the largest recipient, not the recipient, the largest winner of the Ardoff auction, LTD Broadband, and they are really a wireless provider, but they've come out and said, no, we're going to go ahead and do a combination of wireless and fiber. But they have not received anything, and there's a question as to what they will receive and where. I think the FCC is really scrutinizing their long-form application. They're probably going, area by area to determine, okay, are we going to give them any money? If we are, where are we going to give it to them? Do we think they can do it? There's been a lot of blowback from other people that were in the auction that said LTD should not have won that. They don't have the capacity to do all of this. So we'll have to see what happens with that. So that's a big one. Then you've got Starlink, as I mentioned. So, whether or not Starlink is going to get any funds is questionable. Like I had mentioned last time, there may be some really hard to reach areas where the FCC, if they're scrutinizing these unserved areas, they may say, you know what, this is on top of a mountain and it's going to take a while to get fiber there. This might be a good place to put satellite, or to provide some funds to Starlink. Now, if they do that, that's still going to be an unserved area according to this BEAD program. So even if RDOF comes out, if the FCC comes out and says, yeah, okay, in these particular areas, we can go ahead and have Starlink provide service. We're going to let them, since they're the winner of the auction in that area, we're going to let them go ahead and have the funds. And again, what does that mean? Again, that might be a subsidy for, those, I forget how much those terminals are. I think they might have them down to, I think $500 now, approximately $500. So that might pay for the terminal, for example, for the customer, so that they don't have to pay for that, and maybe there's something else they can do for that. But that being the case, again, at some point in the future, somebody may come out and say, you know what, we can reach that area. We can overbuild that. It doesn't count for the BEAD program because it's going to be considered unserved because it's satellite, if that makes sense. It says here, there have been plenty of concerns about whether BEAD will fuel overbuilding in areas set to be covered by RDOF, especially given the decision to classify areas covered with unlicensed spectrum and satellite as unserved. But Davidson said the NOFO guidelines were specifically designed to avoid penalizing states for money that's expected for deployments which haven't been built yet. But there will be a screening process to avoid overbuilding, he added. So for purposes of determining each state's allocation, Davidson said it will purely rely on the FCC maps, which will detail areas that are served right now. But when states submit their broadband plans, he said the NTIA will insist they don't use federal funding in areas already approved to receive support from other programs. So I was also going to show you from the NOFO what it says about that. So this says here, in identifying an unserved service project or underserved service project, an eligible entity, that would be a state, may not treat as unserved or underserved any location that is already subject to an enforceable federal, state, or local commitment to deploy qualifying broadband as of the date that the challenge process described in section blah, blah, blah of this NOFO is concluded. So the FCC, I'm sure, is trying as quickly as possible to get all of the ready to authorize and authorized announcements out there. And anything that's RDOF, if there's RDOF that's been determined to be ready to authorize, then that will not count, and you cannot overbuild there, or you cannot apply Bead funds because there's already a federal program. Specifically here it says, an enforceable commitment for the deployment of qualifying broadband to a location exists when the commitment to deploy qualifying broadband service to the location was made as a condition of, and it talks about grants and loans, talks about some other things here, but then specifically I wanted to cover this. Any high-cost universal service support provided under Section 254 of the Communications Act, except that in the case of RDOF, a location will be considered to have an enforceable commitment for qualifying broadband only, A, after the FCC has announced in a public notice that RDOF support for that location is ready to authorize or is authorized, and B, the provider does not rely on satellite technologies to deliver service. So really, to boil that down, if the FCC has come out and said that, okay, we've authorized, let's say, LTD broadband in these areas, we're authorized or we're ready to authorize for them for these areas, then those areas are off the table. Okay, they are no longer going to be considered unserved. Now, if they do the same thing, as I mentioned, with Starlink, and they say these areas, Starlink is going to be getting RDOF funds, those are not off the table because, as it says here, the provider does not rely on satellite technologies to deliver service. So satellite technology would be fair game, but any other, like wireless technology, or assuming it's licensed, because we still have well, I'm not sure about that. It doesn't mention license here as far as spectrum goes, but we know that if there's some other technology in there, then that would take that area off the table if it's been RDOF and approved, ready to authorize or authorize. And once it's ready to authorize, it's like 2 weeks. Once they say it's ready to authorize, there's only 2 more steps that the provider has to do. There's a credit letter and a bankruptcy letter, and then they're done. So usually they're ready to authorize, and then 2 weeks or so later, the FCC says they're authorized, and they get that money. Let's see, what's left here in this article. So for the purposes of determining each state's allocation, Davidson said it will purely rely on the FCC maps, which will detail areas that are served right now. But when states submit their broadband plans, he said the NTIA will insist they don't use federal funding in areas already approved to receive support from other programs. I may have already read that. So the FCC maps, again, are key, but as I mentioned earlier, there's going to be the first brush stroke of that we see when the FCC comes out later, sometime in the fall, and then there's the whole challenge process. So September 1st is the date that all the data is supposed to be in, as I mentioned, but then there's going to be some period where the FCC is going to get the maps ready, then the challenge process. So all that's going to be taking place. And while all of that's taking place, it could be that the FCC is continuing to make ready authorizations or authorizations for RDOF. So that's kind of a moving target until the point where the NTIA and FCC get together and say, okay, that's the end. Okay, now we're going with these maps. And then finally, will there be further guidance on issues like supply chain rules, workforce requirements, and tax status? So he said yes. Davidson said there will be a lot of information that was not included in the NTIA's NOFOs, and it plans to issue additional guidance around topics such as supply chain and workforce issues. He did say, however, that the NTIA plans to abide by the Buy American requirement passed by Congress, though it fully expects there to be some waivers. This is there are a couple of issues here. It is very difficult right now for broadband operators who are even trying to deploy broadband right now in getting fiber. There's a long lead time on that, and getting equipment, and making sure that there are enough people to do the work. And that could be just like an engineering firm. I was watching something the other day. They were saying the professional engineers are going to be in short supply, and probably already are. So if you are a service provider and you are planning on deploying broadband, and you are going to need, let's say, in order to get federal funds, you're going to need a professional engineer to sign off on stuff. You need to be getting that in place, because there's going to be a shortage of those kinds of folks, and they may not be able to handle any more clients at some point. So you got professional engineers, and you got your fiber installers, you got all of the people that need to put this stuff together, and there are going to be workforce shortages partially because there's just workforce shortages in general right now, but also because the demand is going to be so high, lots of money all at once, already happening now with these other programs like RDOF and ARPA, plus everything that's coming down the road with Bead. There are going to be a lot of folks that are going to be needed to do this. And this is a jobs program, so we need to get people trained as well. Now, of course, it's going to be a lot harder to train an engineer than it is somebody to be able to splice fiber, but we need to make sure that we have enough people moving forward. So there's lots of opportunities for you guys that are students or whatever, be looking at this as an opportunity to be able to get into an industry that is going to be growing in the short term and really is going to have opportunities throughout. The other question is we got workforce issues, then we got supply chain issues, we got workforce issues. He did say, however, the NTIA plans to abide by the Buy American requirement. So that's the other thing, is that there is this Buy American requirement in here. And there are fairly, you've got to get moving on these things. Once you get your money, you've got to get moving. You got a certain amount of time that you got to get all of this done. He mentioned this, he fully expects there to be some waivers. So, for example, if you are trying to get equipment and it's got to be American equipment, you can't buy equipment from somewhere else, and there's long lead times on that because everybody in this program is trying to buy American equipment, then yeah, they're going to have to do some waivers. The same thing with maybe if there are workforce issues and you can say, listen, I need a professional engineer to sign off on this. I can't find one right now. Everybody is booked. Then you've got those kinds of things, and there may be waivers for that because we do have these issues. So even though the Buy American requirement is in there, it sounds like depending on extenuating circumstances, that could be waived. I think you'll have to provide fairly good evidence for that. As for the question of whether Bead and other broadband funding will be counted as taxable income, Davidson said that it's not something that would be addressed in an OFO. But it is an issue of ongoing conversation within the administration. He added, onlookers can expect to hear and see more on this front going forward. So this is not something that's under their purview, so to speak. But at some point, this administration, probably, will come out and say, these funds will be taxable, will not be taxable, or they'll have some kind of policy statement on that. So again, this I thought was a good summary of some of the questions that I had, and again, clarified some things that I was not sure about as far as, let's say, satellite broadband. I thought that the states could not apply funds to satellite broadband, but really they are leaving it up to the state. The really key factor is that if money does go to satellite broadband or does go to an area that's only completely unlicensed spectrum, those funds can be applied to that, but those areas are still considered unserved. So that means I suppose a state could allocate a second funding in that area. I don't think they'd want to do that, but it does also mean that some competitor could come in over there and overbuild if they could get funding, let's say, for fiber. I don't know. I don't know how it's going to work, but it's interesting that they can supply that money for that. Thanks for joining me. So I'll be back tomorrow again with broadband deployment news. If you're not subscribed, click the subscribe button, click the little bell, and you'll be notified. Thanks a lot. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.